Did any actual Titanic survivors watch the 1997 Titanic movie?
I don't think so.
Well, believe it or not, yeah, some of them actually did.
Really?
Before we jump in, I just want to give a huge thank you to all the new Titanic nerds that have recently subscribed. Here on my channel, we talk about the Titanic, disasters, and other historical events, so if that is what you're into, then please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. All right, so we're all very familiar with the 1997 James Cameron Titanic movie.
I'm the king of the world!
I mean, the entire world knows about it. It sparked a worldwide debate and many childhood crushes. And for a lot of you guys, it may have been the thing that really kicked off your interest in Titanic. So it was really a big cultural moment that was hard to ignore. Now, James Cameron's movie premiered on December 19th, 1997. So that was more than 20 years ago. There's Leo, Billy Zane, Francis Fisher. Look at all the actors. They look so young back then. So that was quite a long time ago. Now, at the time of the premiere, there were actually 7 Titanic survivors that were still alive. They were Millvina Dean, Barbara West, Lillian Asplund, Winifred Quick, Michel Navratil, Eleanor Johnson, and Louise LaRoche. And in fact, 2 of these Titanic survivors actually watched the James Cameron movie. Now, one of the names that you probably recognized in this list that I just gave you was Millvina Dean, who was famously the last living survivor up until her death in 2009. She's very well known in the Titanic community, and she famously chose not to watch the movie. So I'm going to get into that a little bit later in the video, but first I want to tell you about the survivors that did watch the movie. Now, I got curious, so I asked you guys on YouTube whether you would have wanted to watch the 1997 James Cameron movie if you had been a Titanic survivor. And it looks like the slight majority of you guys said yes, that you probably would have wanted to watch the movie. And to be honest, I probably would have said yes as well, just because my curiosity would get the best of me. Yeah, I would definitely be interested to watch it. Now, one of the comments by you guys, user Asher H, says, "It's hard to tell as I'm not one, but probably not. I'd think it'd bring up past trauma. And if I were to watch it, I'd make sure I'd already fully healed emotionally from the disaster." So that's a very good point. We need to remember that a lot of these survivors were very much traumatized, which is probably why only 2 out of the 7 chose to watch the movie. Now, the first survivor that did watch the movie was passenger Eleanor Johnson Shuman. Now, Eleanor, she was about 1.5 years old when she boarded the Titanic. She was traveling with her mother and her baby brother, and they were all saved in one of the aft starboard lifeboats. It's believed it's either 13 or 15, they're not entirely sure, but her and her brother and her mother, they were saved. Now, during the 1950s, Eleanor, her mother, and her brother, they were guests at screenings for both the 1953 Titanic movie and the 1958 Titanic movie, A Night to Remember. In 1997, Eleanor was the only survivor that actually had a chance to meet James Cameron, and they met on set during the filming of the movie. James Cameron did mention that he really enjoyed meeting her. We can see them interacting here in this picture, and it was a very touching moment for James Cameron meeting this real-life survivor. Now, upon the release of the movie, Eleanor got a special screening to watch the movie in Chicago, and I believe there were actually 2 screenings that were done specifically for her. She was, of course, a guest of honor, and they made her feel truly special. Eleanor ended up watching the movie a total of 3 times, and she mentioned that she cried every single time. She also mentioned that the whole process was very emotionally draining for her, as you can imagine. Throughout her life, she also ended up doing some press, television, radio, newspaper interviews. She was asked to sign many autographs, and she had actually attended several Titanic conventions in the 1990s as well. So she ended up being quite active in the Titanic community toward the end of her life. Eleanor then passed away just a few months after the release of Titanic in March of 1998 at the age of 87. Now, the second survivor to have watched the movie was passenger Michel Navratil. Now, for some of you, this name probably rings a bell because Michel Navratil was one of the famous Titanic orphans. If you guys don't know the story of the Titanic orphans, I think I gotta make an entire video on this because it's truly an incredible story. But basically, what happened is the following. Michel and his brother, they were both very young at the time. They were essentially taken out of France by their father, Michel Sr. The father and the wife, they were separated, and he essentially took the children and he boarded the Titanic on his way to America. They used a fake name. Long story short, during the sinking, Michel Sr. managed to get the two boys into Collapsible D, which was the last lifeboat that was launched from the Titanic. There was no room for him to go, so unfortunately he passed away, but the two boys lived. So then the brothers made it to New York, and they were the only children that were unaccompanied. And because they were traveling under fake names, it was basically impossible for authorities to identify them. So there were a lot of reporters that took pictures of them, and newspapers ran the story of these, quote, Titanic orphans. And their mother back in France basically saw the press, recognized the boys from the pictures, and she immediately was like, okay, wait, those are my children, what the heck? So she made her way over to New York. A French-speaking passenger on the Titanic named Margaret Hayes, she had been taking care of the boys until they were finally reunited with their mother. Now, there's a lot more that goes into that story, but that's the summary. Now back to Michel Navratil. Unlike Eleanor, he did not watch the Titanic movie immediately. He actually waited a couple of years, and he ended up watching the movie from the comfort of his own home. Michel's daughter later said that he was very moved by the experience, by watching the movie, and that he had tears in his eyes the entire time. Michel ended up passing away in January of 2001 at the age of 92, and he was the last living male survivor at the time of his death. Now, earlier in this video, I mentioned that one of the most famous survivors, Millvina Dean, famously chose not to watch the movie. Now, the reason why is because obviously there was a lot of trauma still there. Since she was just a young baby, she actually didn't find out that she was on the Titanic until she was 8 years old because her mother refused to talk about it. And for a big portion of her life, Millvina refused to talk about it with anyone. Now, in her later years, when she was in her 70s and older, she decided to embrace the stories of the Titanic and share the experiences that she heard from her mother. She became much more involved in the Titanic community. She did some traveling to various Titanic themed events. And actually, when the wreck was discovered in 1985, that hit her hard. She was horrified at the thought of people poking around the site of her father's grave. It really opened up the wound for her. She really was opposed to the idea of people going in there and prying, and she really saw the wreck of the Titanic as a gravesite for all the people that had perished that night. Now, when James Cameron's Titanic movie came out in 1997, she immediately refused to watch that. She wasn't interested. She recalled having nightmares from when she watched the 1958 Titanic movie, A Night to Remember, and she just didn't want to go through that again. She didn't want to imagine her father vividly standing there while the ship was sinking. She would later decline invitations to go watch Ghost of the Abyss, which is the documentary that came out in the early 2000s, and she actually criticized the BBC when they released an episode of Doctor Who where there's a cruise liner that's depicted as having the name of Titanic. She said, "The Titanic was a tragedy which tore so many families apart. I lost my father and he lies on that wreck. I think it is disrespectful to make entertainment of such a tragedy." So as you can tell, the Titanic was a very sensitive topic for her, so it's totally understandable why she would not want to see it depicted on the big screen. And on May 31st, 2009, at the age of 97, Millvina Dean peacefully passed away. And sadly, there are no more survivors left. But I think it's very obvious that the story and the spirit of Titanic, the incredible stories of her survivors, and the true acts of heroism that were seen that night, they live on because of you guys, because of the Titanic community, because we continue to keep those stories alive. So I hope that you guys learned something new today with this video. Now, if you guys want to see some more Titanic topics, like what happened to Titanic's lifeboats, I suggest watching this video here. And if you want to see me debunk some common Titanic conspiracy theories, watch this video here. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this video, for subscribing to the channel. I really hope you enjoyed it. As always, the link to all the Titanic Guy merch is in the description, and I'll see you guys next week.